as I'm sure you have, people who are uh, militant proselytizers of psychedelics who are prone to the same type of rhetoric that seemed to cause a lot of trouble in the earlier iteration of all this in the 60s, putting it in the drinking water, making it legal. You want to go to 7-Eleven and just get a LSD smoothie. Seems like a bad idea to me. Then you have people on the far other end of the spectrum, certainly in not too distant history, who would not even consider publishing a scientific study involving psychedelics, wouldn't even consider the scientific merit of a study. And we seem to be in a very, well, as you put it, a renaissance where research is finally being done to clarify the mechanisms of action and the potential, but also the risks of these drugs. And it's so exciting to me, having really spent so much time as you have looking at this. What are the ways that people can screw this up? Do you know what I mean? Because it's just, I really, really think we have an incredible opportunity to decipher how these plants and compounds that have in many cases existed, well, certainly existed, but been consumed for millennia, and how they fit into a world that is bursting at the seams with not decreasing but increasing prevalence of certain types of mental health problems and other issues. It's such an opportunity that I don't want to see wasted. How can people screw it up? And what would you, is there anything you would ask of people? Certainly I would say to people, don't find some shaman on like Casual Encounters on Craigslist, and mail order God knows what from the dark web and just decide to do it with your friends on a weekend. A terrible idea, among other things.
Yeah. And going down to Peru and with the first, shaman you meet. I mean, there have been horrible stories coming out of Peru with, sexual assault of women. And there was a murder the other day involving a healer in Peru. So I think carelessness is the great threat. And I think carelessness is part of what doomed psychedelics in the 60s, or temporarily doomed them in the 60s. One of the great lessons, if you study history, is that until our own time, when psychedelics came along and we didn't have any sort of conventions or rules to govern their use, and many people did get into trouble, and the psychedelics themselves, catalyzed a kind of backlash. But you go in history and you see that these powerful substances were only used in a very controlled, considered way, and that you didn't have individuals taking them on their own. There was always a circle. There were always elders. There was the shaman. There was the person who had lots of experience of the territory administering it to people. It was always organized in a ritual. There was a ceremony. All these cultural forms. I'm not saying those ones are right and we should simply adapt those or adopt those. They may not be right to Western culture. We may have to come up with our own rituals, our own ceremonies, our own rules of the road for these drugs. And I think that to some extent that was the failure of the 60s. Now, I don't want to paint it with a broad brush. There are many people who had wonderful experiences with psychedelics in the 60s, who had important insights and created great art as a result of their experiences. But for the culture as a whole, it led to this backlash and a fair amount of suffering, and also the loss of 30 years of good research that we could have been doing. And I think that had to do with the fact that we did not have a proper cultural container. So the question we now face is, what is that container? One of them is the medical system. That's the path that they are on at NYU and Hopkins. I don't think that's the only path. I agree strongly with Bob Jesse, who's one of the motive forces behind the revival of research, who says, yes, there are people who are suffering and we have to help them, but these drugs are also good for what he calls the betterment of well people. People like myself, people like yourself. and that it would be a shame if their use was restricted only toward people with, DSM diagnoses of one kind or another. So what's the proper vessel for them? Is it a religious vessel? Well, that's not comfortable with everybody. We need to figure this out. The Greeks apparently used a psychedelic, and the mysteries of Eleusis, or the Eleusinian mysteries, as they're called, was an annual rite where everyone who wanted to in the culture, well, not the slaves, but not just the elite, used something called the kykeon, which was a psychedelic apparently, and they had visions, and they went to the afterworld or the underworld, and it was a very powerful annual rite. You were not allowed to use the kykeon any other time. In fact, somebody once did. They got a hold of some, and they had a party, and they were severely punished for doing this because they understood that this had to be taken in the best interest of the whole society in a way that was carefully regulated. And so I think that's where we find ourselves. I think that is figuring out a way to use these drugs to make them accessible to more people, but to contain their risks, and to house them in a cultural form that's appropriate to them and appropriate to us. That, I think, is how you prevent the kind of carelessness that led to trouble. I think Leary's sin, if he had one, was giving up on the idea of a guide. And I think that the guide, whether it's a friend who stays close to ground or somebody preferably very well trained and experienced, makes all the difference. And especially as you get older, I think, where you're less of a risk taker, people in their 20s will do the craziest things. I mean, look at the way they drive, let alone the way they take drugs. But as you get older, working with a guide is at least it was for me, made the experience, created a space in which I could surrender and put down all my defenses. I'm not going to do that, walking around Manhattan. And so we have a lot of work to do, designing the experience and understanding what the drugs are doing, but designing the experience in a way that is safe and conducive to the kind of work we want to do.
It's such an exciting area of exploration. I'm cautiously optimistic.
I am too.
Cautiously optimistic. And you and I have both interviewed people and heard these stories of transformation, not just anecdotal, but also in very controlled scientific environments. And you also hear stories, as I'm sure you have. I heard a story recently when I was talking about the phase 3 trials with someone, and their nephew, who is, I want to say 18 or 19, probably getting the age wrong, doesn't really matter for the purposes of illustrating, but he has suffered from severe OCD for many years, which has been debilitating. Smart kid, did a ton of research, went on to PubMed, ultimately determined that he thought psilocybin might be a tool to help mitigate his OCD, and it worked. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But due to the legal classification, he was caught with mushrooms and expelled from school. And it's just so tragic in a case like that these tools are not available to those who could benefit. And I really hope that people will, at the very least, consider the importance of scientifically exploring these things. And there's so many different angles of examination, but that's certainly one. At the very least, I mean, supporting those who are attempting to understand how these things do what they do. And I have to commend you for putting this book together. And I mentioned this to you in person some time ago, but there was simultaneously great relief and great kind of hand to the forehead, because you saved me from attempting to write what would have no doubt been a far inferior book. So I really appreciate you taking the time and also the bringing on board and not relinquishing your skepticism as you explored this entire world and this subject matter. I really think that it is such a critical subject at such a critical time. So I not only, and I don't get any vig on this, certainly recommend people read it themselves, but it's a book that I think is mind expanding on so many levels, even if you never have any interest in consuming a psychedelic of any type. It is an incredible lens through which to learn more about the mind and more about ultimately your entire experience of reality is as far as we know is filtered through this thing we hold between our ears. Getting to know it better certainly seems in everyone's best interest. But I really appreciate all the time that you've taken today, and hope we can talk about this many more times. But besides people reading the book, which everyone should, I really I've read many of your books. It is my favorite of your books. It's such a difficult tightrope to walk, and you really did an excellent job in so many ways. Do you have any parting comments, suggestions, asks of the audience?
It's funny. People have asked me, am I an advocate for psychedelics? And the answer is no, not yet. I'm an advocate, as you just said. I thought you said quite eloquently, the research. We have to support the research. There is enormous potential here, but it still has a long way to go. We haven't answered all the questions. As you say, this is a book, and this is an enterprise, speaking larger than the book, to understand the mind. It's not to understand psychedelics. Psychedelics are a tool, as Stanislav Grof said all those years ago. They are a really powerful tool to understand the mind and potentially your mind. I think keep abreast of the research. Read some of these papers. Read some of Robert Carhart Harris's papers. There are more books to be written about it, Tim. I don't think you should give up on that idea. I think you should just wait a little bit. There's so much to be said. It is I feel like every now and then as a writer, you get lucky and you hit the right topic at the right moment. And I just felt like, oh my God, I'm a kid in a candy store. I have this amazing subject. I'm learning so many things I didn't know. It was the most exciting experience I've had as a writer. And I'm hoping, that the reader feels the same way.
Yeah, you paddled for the wave at the right time, I think. And for